Well, hi, everyone. Hi to all of those of you on Zoom. This is a very strange experience. I must say we've not quite done anything like this before. We've had a meeting in the room with 2 people on Zoom, and we've had many, many meetings with all of us on Zoom. And tonight we've kind of flipped it in a different way. Can I just ask those of you on Zoom to make sure you're muted as we get underway, please? And do not fear, we will come to you and invite you to unmute and be a part of our discussion as it unfolds. Hi, those of you who don't know me, my name is Melinda Hinkson. Welcome here to the Institute of Postcolonial Studies. We're delighted to have you join us for imagining a new social contract for food and feeding in Australia. As we begin, let me acknowledge Aboriginal traditional owners and custodians. Here in Naarm in North Melbourne, we honour Wurundjeri elders, land managers, and all people working in the care of their country and waterways, and indeed in the growth of native foods. I also warmly acknowledge all First Nations people who are joining us this evening. Tonight we are here to discuss ideas in Gabrielle Chan's compelling new book, which I have a copy right here, beautifully, very poignantly, provocatively titled. And I note, Gabby, that the feel of this title changes depending on where you put the emphasis. But my preferred emphasis, and the obvious one for all of us, I think, here tonight, is why you should give a fuck about farming. Would you like to hold that for us, Richard? Our esteemed panel is going to explore the complex forces that dominate the production and consumption of fresh food in Australia. They will explore the pressures on farmers. They will ask what is wrong with our food system. They will ask why we need a federal ministry of food. And we will consider how food might be centred in a new social imaginary, if you like, or a new social movement for a just and healthy Australia. Now, Australian political culture encourages those of us who reside in the city, to imagine that farmers are, people out there somewhere separate from us. But as Gabby puts it in her book, if you eat and wear clothes, or even just eat or wear clothes, the decisions you make influence farming. A key aim of our Future of Food project here at the Institute is to stimulate better discussion leading to actual change between people in the cities and the regions over such matters of shared responsibility. We're grateful to the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation for their support for our research and our outreach. And next year, we look forward to hosting events that explore First Nations calls for Indigenous food sovereignty, the future of labour in Australian agriculture, and imagining coexistence through new approaches to land sharing. We're really pleased once again to be hosting these discussions with our friend at the Mildura Writers Festival. And before I briefly introduce our speakers, let me invite Creative Director Donata Corazza to say a few words.
Thanks, Melinda. Hi, and welcome to all from Mildura in northwestern Victoria. I'd like to thank Melinda again, Carlos, and all at the Institute for this partnership with the Mildura Writers Festival and for their hard work in organising tonight's event. I acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land on which our festival takes place, the Lachi Lachi, Nyeri Nyeri, Ningtate and Wirgaya people, along with the Barkinji, Marara, Muti Muti, Tati Tati and Wachabaluk people. At our last event, we investigated water policy and its impact on stakeholders who rely on the health of our rivers, while tonight's discussion asks us to focus on our farmers as part of the system that feeds and clothes us under an onslaught of existential issues relating to climate change, soil and water degradation. Mildura is geographically positioned in the heart of dryland farming and irrigated horticulture that produces fruits, nuts and vegetables for a national and international market. The long-term livelihood of our region is dependent on advances made in the farming sector that embrace sustainable practices and even consider alternative ones like regenerative farming. Such scenarios can seem a world away from city preoccupations, but we're all ultimately dependent on what happens next in our primary industries, and events like these can help bridge the gaps that do exist. I'm really looking forward to hearing tonight's speakers share their views on priorities in the farming sector and how we can encourage change through our choices as consumers. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Donata. So let me now very, very briefly introduce our speakers in the reverse order to what we're going to which we will hear from them. Stefano De Pierri is a restaurateur, a Mildura City Councillor, and a passionate advocate of human scale growing and eating. Steph has promoted community-based food production through the celebrated television program A Gondola on the Murray, and earlier this year, Australia's Food Bowl, which if you missed, you can still catch on SBS On Demand. And we here at IPCS are very proud to have Stefano as our patron. Richard Cornish is a passionate advocate of sustainable food events and a renowned food writer. An author of many books, including on Spanish and Mexican food, Richard writes for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald in a regular column called Brain Food. He's been a judge for the prestigious Banksia Awards, and he was an architect of one of the original architects of the Australian Food Awards. Lauren Rickards is a human geographer and a professor at RMIT University, where she leads the Climate Change Transformations Research Program, among other things. Lauren researches the socio-cultural dimensions of environmental change in agri-food systems. She's a lead author with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and she is our lead researcher on the Future of Food project. Pete Mailer, who is joining us from near Bogabilla, runs a farming and grazing enterprise in northern New South Wales with his wife Claire. Pete has an extensive background in industry and community advocacy in the grain industry. He's an advocate for meaningful action on climate change and renewable energies, and for better political representation for regional Australia. Pete founded and ran the Country Minded Party at the New England by-election in 2017. And in the run-up to the 2019 election, he joined forces with the Australian Democrats. And finally, Gabrielle Chan, who will open our discussion, has been a journalist for more than 30 years, working across News Limited, the ABC and Guardian Australia. Her book, Rusted Off, Why Country Australia is Fed Up, was shortlisted for the 2019 Prime Minister's Literary Awards and the 2019 Walkley Prize. Just a few months ago, Gabby established the Rural Network with Guardian Australia. And as indicated, tonight we are here to talk about her new book, Why You Should Give a Fuck About Farming. So thanks very much to everybody for joining us. We're looking forward to a fantastic discussion. And Gabby, we're going to throw over to you.
Thanks very much, Melinda, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me to talk about this book. I just want to start also acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we live, and that's the Wiradjuri people, their elders past and present. I've learnt a lot from the local Wiradjuri people, and so I think that's important. I guess I came to this book thinking it would be quite a simple task, which was naive, I know, in the extreme. And I had lived on the farm for 25 years, and I qualified this by saying I'm not a farmer, I'm a journalist. I hang out with a farmer, but I've lived up close to farming for all that time. But as a political reporter, the thing that was really starting to bug me in the political debate was this kind of separation of the debates around agriculture on the one hand, environment on the other hand, and then this thing that was totally separated, which was food. And I started looking into it because increasingly my political reporting was taking me to regional areas that were, in the modern term, disrupting, changing the way they vote, or at least getting cranky with the people that they were asked to vote for, because of changes that were happening to these communities on the ground. And so on the one hand, farming seemed to only affect, if you believe the political debate, this, you know, small percentage, some 2% of Australians involved in farming. But on the other, farmers were having this effect on more than half the landscape in Australia. They were feeding the nation. So I started by thinking, you know, does it really matter, this industry, this thing that we do called farming, and what does it actually mean? Is it a vestige of some quaint occupation that we don't need to worry about anymore because we have services industries and things that are so much more sexy? Or is it really still foundational to the way humans live, the way Australia lives? And I quickly discovered that even though Australia's white settlement, at least, had been based on agriculture largely, we didn't really think about it deeply, because we think, you know, politicians think that problem's solved. We always hear, oh, we export so much of, you know, more than half of what we produce. We don't need to worry about food security. We're a very food secure nation. And then in the pandemic, I started writing the book, researching the book in 2019. We hit the pandemic in 2020, and I'm presented with this live experiment right before my eyes of people facing empty shelves, thinking about, you know, how much food we produce, where it comes from, who we're reliant on. We saw a shortage of rice, and we saw countries like Vietnam's big rice exporters shut down their borders. So suddenly everyone started to get a little uneasy about food and what it meant in Australia and what our food supply was doing. The more I pulled this thread, it was just a single thread that I wanted to pull from this farm, the more I realized that farming as an industry is exposed to existential threats that the world is trying to solve more than pretty much any other industry. You know, that the things that Melinda mentioned before, that Donato mentioned before, the climate change, soil loss, water shortages, zoonotic diseases, even the trade disruptions that we're seeing, the trade, the kind of phony war between the US and China. All of these things were playing out, particularly in the last 2 years. And so I started looking at the problems, and Pete Mailer, who you'll hear from next, we've had many long discursive discussions about these issues. And I started to realize, you know, that, and he was the one that first alerted me to this issue, that, you know, farming is changing rapidly. The middle of farming, who we think of as the kind of average Australian farmer, is hollowing out in a way, because the small and the small have great kind of buy-in to their consumers, the very large have scale, and the middle people are really being hollowed out. And I think that was leading to the political disruptions I was seeing. I was seeing a food system that doesn't really account for the true cost of food. So we've become accustomed to the arguments and the debates over, you know, whether we should have $1 a litre milk. You know, how is it that you can have a punnet of berries for $2? How is it that you can have a bag of almonds for such a cheap price when they used to be so expensive? And yet at the same time, the demands on farming were increasing, because as climate change continues, farmers are increasingly being asked to not only produce that cheap food, but also to ameliorate some of the causes of climate change, sequester carbon, to look after waterways. And all of those things, of course, should be a part of landscape management, but there's a conversation to be had, I think, about, well, what is the cost of producing those almonds or those berries or the wheat for the flour? So that's where I sort of landed on this idea of a new contract between farmers and eaters, because it's not just a call to arms from the eating end. It's also a call to arms for farmers, because farmers are very well known for what's the saying? Socializing the losses and privatizing the profits. This idea that you can be the master of your domain within your boundary fences, and what you do doesn't have an effect. Well, good and bad farming can have an effect long outside the boundary fences. And so that contract, I think, needs better understanding between both ends of the spectrum. I think we need, it's not a matter of going back to a protected agriculture. We had a protected agriculture. It also had problems. I think it needs a more sophisticated and nuanced contract. I thought about the idea of a sort of national backyard plan where we had much better planning, so that we don't end up in fights over, say, prime agricultural land and, oh, should I put an open cut mine there, or should I use it for growing good food? Well, those sorts of decisions you would think would be a no-brainer. So that idea of a backyard plan, a contract between farmers and eaters, and the idea of elevating farming and food to a portfolio that really was embedded as important as an element like defence in a national government. All of these things, I think, are worth considering as the world changes rapidly. So I'll leave it there, because I know we've got a lot of speakers, but hopefully that kicks off the conversation in a way to keep it going.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gabby. Over to you, Pete.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep, that's great.
Right. Look, I guess, as Gabby said, we've talked a lot over time, and a lot of what she says is, pretty much what I can roll out. But I guess I have a couple of questions, and, some things that came out of that conversation for me very quickly. I listened to, and I'm very proactive and very passionate about issues like climate change, stewardship. Our ambition has always been to leave the country better than we found it. And a lot of farmers, that's their motivation. But so one of the questions that I constantly ask is why do you think farmers do what they do? And this is part of their social contract, I suppose, but pretty much farmers are trying to, they don't get out of bed thinking about how they can exploit the landscape. What they're really trying to work out is how to operate inside a commercial and public policy framework that constrains nearly everything that we do. We don't get paid to do the things that we'd like to do in terms of the stewardship side of what we do. And there are conversations occurring in the country around stewardship, around how we pay for those things. There are conversations around, carbon farming initiatives and things like that, but none of them quite work yet. And it's one of the biggest impediments to the kind of changes that people expect farmers to deliver, and farmers' abilities to deliver them. It comes down to how we survive commercially and financially. So, pretty much everything that farmers have done for 100 years have been driven by public policy and market expectation. There's been some serious problems, some serious consequences of those previous policies and those previous market requirements that we're seeing, very clearly in the landscape today. And how we fix them, it's not as simple as making a judgment on farmers and what they do without going a little bit deeper and saying, well, why are we doing that? How do we fix that? And that's a much deeper conversation than most people are willing to engage in. I listen, and sometimes I'm frustrated by the conversation around agricultural emissions, because most people default to the idea that farmers must do more to ameliorate agricultural emissions. One of the problems in that, of course, is that agricultural emissions are calculated on a whole of life cycle basis. A lot of those emissions don't occur on the farm. In fact, you know, in my grain production business, you know, for every kilogram, for every tonne of wheat that I produce, is 800 kilograms of carbon dioxide coming out of the atmosphere. It's not until you transport, process and consume that product that you release most of the carbon that we've sequestered in that product. Now, I'm not naive. We can't just bury the wheat. You can't do that. But when you talk about wheat emissions globally, and they say, well, you know, there's 200 kilos, 200 to 400 kilos of net carbon emissions for every tonne of wheat produced in the world, it's really important for consumers to understand that that is actually a whole of life cycle number. And a lot of those emissions actually occur off the farm. So I'm not saying that farmers can't do more and shouldn't do more. What I'm saying is that we're all in this together. And I think that notion or that political, you know, convenience is that agriculture is something that people out in the bush do. And a lot of what Gabby talks about is really important to me, because it's very much about, you know, reinforcing the relationship and the interdependence and the interconnectedness between the consumer and the producer. And of course, Australia is a large exporting nation, so our consumers aren't all in Australia. So it's not Australia's, you know, it's not Australian consumers cross the bear either. But there are a lot of things in these conversations which require more nuance. They require more tolerance. And I think one of the problems, you know, that exists is that in the conversations around social license and the conversations around social contracts, a huge number of producers who are genuinely committed to doing the right thing as best they can do feel a little bit that people are judging and certainly attacking them in some sense, which is, you know, we get this conflict emerging and this push and push back arrangement. And so how we balance that and how we bring everybody along in the conversation in a constructive discourse is one of the biggest challenges we have. And of course, that leads to the political conversation, because the lens through which most Australians see the bush is Barnaby Joyce. And it's a disaster because, excuse me, Barnaby Joyce does not speak for me. He doesn't speak for most farmers. He's not even elected by farmers in most instances. And this is a great challenge that we have in terms of how agriculture is seen from people outside of the bush. And it's a great challenge as to how do we fix that, because that representation issue is fundamental to every conversation we're going to have going forward about how we change agriculture, how we change what it is that society expects of farmers, and how we change or enable the change, you know, how we enable the changes that society expects. And the current rhetoric is completely counterproductive, is the right word. And it's not just a political problem, it also comes down through the institutions that represent farmers to a large extent. They are inherently conservative. They don't embrace the diversity that they need to embrace to develop more rounded positions on things. They are inherently conservative, as I said, so they don't like the idea of change. And that's one of our biggest challenges too, that these conservative organisations are by their very nature resisting the kind of progress that we need. I'm the first to say I don't see things the way everyone else sees them, but I think when you break down and have quiet conversations, most people land in a similar position. I think it's a huge challenge, and I think the conversations you're trying to manage now are really important, and I encourage you to keep doing that. I'm probably more better at following up and answering questions than I'm about giving a great speech. So I've probably covered the points that I really wanted to make initially. I will say, though, that globally, no central government in the world wants food prices to go up. And the reality is that Australian agriculture receives some of the lowest levels of support in the OECD. We've got some of the biggest challenges in terms of landscape management and stewardship, and how we treat our landscape going forward. And that costs money, and that's one of our biggest challenges now. Australia is out of step with the rest of the world in how they regard, how they support the agriculture sector to do things better. I'll park it there for the minute, and let's see how the conversation goes. And hopefully I'm being a bit controversial, and hopefully some questions emerge out of the back of that.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Pete. Now we're going over to Lauren.
Great, thanks, Melinda, and thank you so much, Gabby and Pete. I'd just like to start by congratulating you on the book, Gabby, and highly recommending it to everybody who's yet to read it, and thank Pete for those very useful insights. So I'm coming to this question around the future of food and agriculture, both from the perspective of someone who's got a history, a family history in agriculture, but also has a professional interest in futures, which makes me somewhat, gives me whiplash at times when I'm turning backwards and forwards so much. I have to say that the recent months have really reinforced the complexity of that dual perspective. So as Melinda mentioned, one of my roles is as a lead author with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Not for the report that came out recently, though that was a big event in IPCC world, but for the one that's forthcoming in February on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. And one of the things that role has given me, and the insights around climate change that it affords, is just to reinforce the vital importance of some of the key messages coming out of COP26. So that's to do with the importance of addressing agricultural emissions, as Pete touched on, the importance of Australia addressing its emissions. At the same time, those boundaries around that idea of national emissions, of agricultural emissions, are also deeply problematic. As Pete said, we're all in this together. And while we definitely need systems of greenhouse gas accounting, to read too much into those sorts of figures is to miss the fact that we are in this highly globalized world with deep, deep interconnections, including our food systems. And at the same time, we have increasingly diffuse sources of greenhouse gases as natural systems respond to the climate change that we've generated primarily through fossil fuels. So there's a whole lot to discuss there, and I'm happy to come back to it, but I wanted to focus on something that was very much neglected in the Australian media coverage of COP26, which is the question of adaptation. So you may not have noticed, but during COP26, the Australian government released its new National Climate Adaptation and Resilience Strategy. You may have not noticed it because very little was said about it, and perhaps that's because the less said about it, the better. It's highly perverse that we are in this situation of actually being so quietist about adaptation in Australia. I don't need to talk about recent examples of impacts, but I also wanted to highlight that Australia used to be a leader on climate change adaptation, and in particular used to be a leader on agricultural climate change adaptation. I know because I was the national coordinator for the Primary Industries Adaptation Research Network, which was part of the big National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility that has since been defunded. At the same time, it's also perverse for the more acute reason that increasingly agriculture in Australia, as around the world, increasingly faces deep, deep challenges. And some of those risks are ones that Gabby covers extremely well in her book. And as she documents, those risks are often very familiar. Agriculture is more familiar than most in dealing with risk. Risk is an ongoing topic of conversation. But the thing is that the risks are changing, and not all of our prior experience and existing experience on managing risks is useful. And in fact, arguably, some of the ways that have become very ingrained in our institutions and approaches are highly, highly reductionist. They put things in those silos, they put things in boxes. And what that blinds us to is, just as with the emissions, it blinds us to the interconnections between the risks, the fact that those risks come in different shapes these days and often come via different routes. One of the things Melinda and I have investigated so far in our Future of Food project is looking at some of the questions around supply chain disruptions that the COVID-19 pandemic has introduced. And some of those have affected agriculture in unexpected ways. I'm thinking here around things like semiconductors, computer parts, that are not only exacerbated by COVID-19, but can also be traced to things like drought in Taiwan, where most of the world's semiconductors are produced, and it's highly reliant on hydroelectric power. So it's these sorts of combinations, often called in science terms, I'm going to have to shout above the helicopter, compound risks and cascading risks, that are the ones that we really, really need to pay attention to. And that is the sort of thing that we need to build into this new social contract for agriculture and food. There's a whole range of different insights about this in Gabby's book, but I want to just focus on a couple of really, really key ones. One is the relationship between these issues of risk and what she discusses under the title of farming culture. And perhaps one of the greatest challenges that agriculture has faced for a long time, and I've seen this throughout my life, is the quest, this overarching sense of a quest of needing to prove agriculture's worth, prove that it's rational, prove that it's scientific, prove that it's a real business. And back when I did my PhD, or DPhil as it was called, over in Oxford, I looked at this in terms of its historical roots back in the origins of the first ever higher education on agriculture. Now, it might not surprise you to know that agriculture had a really hard time getting into universities. People laughed at the idea of somehow having a university degree on something which someone quipped as saying, never fully losing the whiff of manure. How could you have a degree and a course that smelt like manure in something like Oxford or Cambridge or even Harper Adams Agricultural College? And when you start to look into it, you realise that there's been a huge amount of effort that's gone into denying the roots of not just our knowledge and biological reliance on agriculture, but actually the fact that agriculture is at the base of a lot of our social models. And I'm thinking here about the idea of development, the idea that agriculture is a primary sector, primary production, from which others like the tertiary sector, which I now sit in, is somehow some kind of advancement on. And I think this gets to the existential threat that Pete mentioned. There's actually a deeper existential threat, that idea that agriculture is something that you pass through, that if you're a farming kid, you actually grow up and you do something different. Or as I found with my PhD research, even those students who are studying agricultural degrees, the idea was that you don't go back to the farm, you don't go backwards to the farm, but you stay in agriculture, but you do that exciting stuff. You do the agribusiness, you do all that corporate stuff, which has now been so influential in Australia. And so when you think about the ways in which we need to really start rethinking agriculture, we need to really restart thinking how we've positioned it in our social histories and our idea of progress and development. And one of the kind of most important insights into this over a recent year or two in Australia has been this idea of recognising that Australian Aboriginal culture has, of course, had its own version of farming, and that forces us to rethink what farming is. It's about shaping landscapes and waterscapes to afford us sustenance. When we start thinking about how we're shaping country to afford us sustenance, to create sustenance, then we have to then build in people. And that's the question that we're asking here tonight. How can we reshape society and our connections with ecosystems, with the wider climate, in ways that actually sustain us? And at the heart of that, we find agriculture and a much broader notion of agriculture than is in dominant forms today. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Can I suggest that they come in? There's enough chairs and we can shut the door to the Barnaby Joyce over our head.
Sorry, people on Zoom, you're probably wondering what's going on. We've just got a helicopter very annoyingly hovering. Not quite sure if it's a political rally, where the defence has heard that this rally is on tonight, whether there's a medical evacuation going on at the local hospital. It might have gone now, Steph. We'll give it a try. Thank you, Lauren. Over to Richard.
Good evening. My name is Richard Cornish. I'm a food writer. I grew up on a farm, and I'm offended that people do not like the whiff of manure. They do not understand the nitrogen cycle. Yeah. I'm really grateful to be here tonight. Honestly grateful. It has been such a hard winter, and being amongst humans again, seeing faces, feeling the heat of bodies and the smell of other people is a little bit overwhelming. I might start crying at any time. Reflections. I worked for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, and I thought when Nine took over the papers, we were going to go on a really cronut path, or looking at the new trends of deep fried pizzas, etc. No, they've invested money. They realised that people are interested in food as narrative, and that food can be a Trojan horse to getting really more interesting stories in front of people. And have been very lucky to be able to get those stories about change, about people adapting, about people being resilient, about people working together, the things that actually hold society together. People working with people understanding their land, and people understanding where food comes from and how it changes the way people feel about themselves. So I've been really, really lucky to do that. Then I'm just going to do some rambling associations here, some rambling ideas that I've been thinking about. One thing I have been noticing is the convergence of the left and right in the food field. Carbon and carbon sequestration will be a way of making money, and the left and the right will agree on that. When we are able to be able to actually quantify how much carbon is going into the soil, that's going to be a real game changer when everyone agrees on those facts. What's going to be really interesting then, if we can, that correlates then with increased fertility in soil and increased nutrition in soil, increased nutrition in food. Now, I'll get on my high horse now and talk about the basic, one thing that really, really I'm passionate about, and that's our noses and our tongues and our mouths and our brains and how they interact with each other. No one in this room, unless you're a sommelier or work in the food industry, has been taught to use your nose and your tongue and your brain together. We have not been taught how to taste. We've not been taught how to understand food. We've not been taught how to evaluate food, because the most nutritious food that we eat, the food that is best for us, is going to be really, really tasty in a really specific way. And we need to have those memories of those foods. We need to be able to understand those foods at an intellectual and emotional level, and also at a purely human level, a human animal level. The way that, my goodness, that lettuce was quite bitter, and I'm actually enjoying digesting my meal now because it's affecting the pH of what's going on in the gut. And then later on, as it gets further into the gut, highly nutritious food feeds the gut. And the gut, a healthy gut and a healthy gut biome is going to give you a healthy brain. We all know that. Cool? So hang on, carbon, nutrition in soil, nutritious food, happier people, less angry people. Okay, that's just another reflection. Another reflection I've seen, I've been staring at, sorry?
Fewer choppers.
Fewer choppers. Yeah, they're upsetting you, aren't they? Have you got something to hide, Stefano?
I've got a sense, mum says.
Oh, yeah, I know, yeah, they're pretty horrible. Pete, our farmer, by the way, I just noticed when you were speaking, were they really wagtails behind you in your audio? I could hear some birds cheeping behind you. It was really sweet. Sign of a good farmer, having lots of bird life around. We're looking at some maps. Were they willy wagtails?
Maybe. There's a whole bunch of different ones out there.
Oh, okay, well, yeah, keep them up. Yeah, keep the cat inside tonight. The other thing I've been noticing, I've been looking at everyone is, I've been looking at maps. Do you look at maps? I love looking at maps. I've been looking at the language maps because people have been talking about the Aboriginal language and what country we're on. I grew up in Bunurong country. I didn't know that until ages ago. Do you know that used to be like, there used to be the Venice of Victoria and Bunurong country, little islands and people on canoes, and they go around at night with a fire. At night, they go and see each other on these little islands. It's called the Cooey Rup Swamp now. They used to go and chat around. They used to cook things on their fires. And I've come to realise that those Aboriginal language groups, from looking on a map, really coincide with the waterways. You look at the Wathaurong language group. It's the Werribee. It's the Werribee River. It's the Barwon, and it's the Mirrabel. And that eventually that would have connected up with Bunurong country when there was 6,000 years ago when those rivers met and the Yarra met in Port Phillip Bay. They were next door neighbours directly. But I'm thinking perhaps we get rid of local councils and replace them with local government based on waterways. So we're all in it together. If we're in Wathaurong country, the people from Ballarat to Geelong, to Barwon Heads and Queenscliff are all in the same country, and they're responsible. They're responsible for that country. They're responsible for the water, and they're responsible for the land, and they're responsible for the bush and the animals and each other. And we talk about the divide between city and country. If we're all listening in this together, I'm just thinking, this is just purely thinking. This is just an idea. It will never happen. But imagine. So the people of Ballarat and Geelong are all working together and make sure the Werribee's working properly, and the Barwon and the Mirrabel are all working properly, and the water's clean, and then the waterways are clean, and the sea's clean as well, because it's all one continuum. And so they're all working together in that little waterway. And perhaps then the Judgawurrung people, which is the Loddon River, they're all working together as well. And that's that shire. So it's not the Mount Alexander Shire, it's not the city of Bendigo, it's not those different shires. It's actually just the one water system. And we're working, and then basically they follow the Aboriginal language groups. Just an idea. And I was thinking about the others. We're all together, and there's see that divide between farmers and city people. And I always just think it was because the farmers were an easy other. They had that whiff of manure. They were the other to the city people. And by degrading the country people, by degrading their culture, their language, what they did for a profession, it made it easier to suppress them and to put them down. And when it comes to paying them money for their crops, it's easier if you just, farmers are over there, we don't respect you as much. And I think it's always happened. I think it's always been that tension between farmers and city people. Ever since we left the walking around as hunter-gatherers, and people started growing grain and grinding it up and started civilization. I just think there's always been that tension between humanity, that we don't respect farmers, but we are them. We are part of what they do. We eat the stuff that becomes us. Whether you're in the city or the farm, we are one. We're all in this together. Cool.
Thank you, Richard. Now over to Stefano.
Thank you, Melinda. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm more confused now than when we first got here. So I wrote copious notes, but as I had imagined, the conversation would fly in every direction and bring up all sorts of topics. And this is a very difficult conversation because we are alternating words like agriculture with food. Well, they're different categories, and we are then introducing elements of emotional elements of community. We're introducing scientific elements of nutrition, and all this conversation, these waves kind of intersect with one another, and in the end, we'll say, where are we? I'm terribly confused. Where is the thread? So let me just start from the beginning. First of all, by praising the book, because we're here prompted by the book that Gabrielle has written. And I think it would be remiss of me if I didn't give it a proper plug for those of you who may not have read it or might be inclined to go and read it, perhaps, because the matters at hand here are so complicated and all these things intersect with one another. It's a spaghetti tree that is very hard to untangle. And the book does that. It does that very systematically and very precisely. So it takes argument by argument and teases it out, and then you see the connection between one argument and the next. almost like a doll inside a doll, inside a doll, inside a doll, if you like. So I urge you to get the book, and I urge you not to forget either the book, its arguments, and tonight's conversation. And in tonight's conversation, for my part, I see some things that are emerging and recurring, and are emerging recurrently several times over and over again. Obviously, it seems to me that culturally in Australia, the city has delegated food production to the countryside and sort of kind of walked away. Yes, once upon a time, we may have had a cousin over there that did some, or we sort of have fantasies about going out and becoming peasants one day. We all interpret it one way or another. Artists have taken huge inspiration from the country and country in general. And painters and literary people, they've all drawn something from the country, but it's always been something out there that someone else worries about. But that's where the food comes from. But we sort of don't connect with that. So that food then in some sort of magic way becomes, the way I see it, and correct me later, but is that kind of sort of a fantasy? It's interpreted by somebody as through the lens of nutrition, for other through whether it is genetically modified, for others whether it's connected to a fantasy of MasterChef, for example. There's some very smart remarks by Gabrielle in the book about this. So food becomes this all things to all people, but it's the one thing we all put in our mouth, and that connects us to this activity called farming. And politically, and I'm jumping a few steps here, we have, as Peter said, we've delegated and we have allowed the delegation of the politics to the National Party, to enormous, what's the word I'm looking for, with enormous damage to the whole process, because there is really no one taking care of all the different elements. It has become a trampoline for political interests, which, mind you, nowadays it's hardly got anything to do with actual farming and the production of food. It's more somebody has appropriated that story in order to flow coal or other things. So the confusion is enormous, it's overbearing, it's overwhelming. And I think it is the responsibility, I think, of the consumers, mostly city people, because that's where the bulk of the population is in Australia, to grab responsibility for food production with both their hands and become much more involved in understanding where it comes from, who benefits from the way things are organized, and become activists, and put out some very, start perhaps with small demands. For instance, now I'm going to food, not to farming, but because these two things seem to intersect all the time. For instance, we are talking about the nutrition, as Richard was. Just imagine being older now and being flogged crappy food in every institution. Imagine being at school where Stephanie Alexander and a few others tried to instigate a process of change and instructing children in what good food is and how to cook and so on, got very little support from the state. There were some touches here and there, a little bit of funding here, a little bit of funding there, but the program has never been fully, to my knowledge, fully endorsed and so on and so forth. Imagine going to a hospital nowadays. It's trauma food. Imagine going to a supermarket. All the food there has been traumatized in one form or another. The milk has been buggerized. Everything is wrapped in plastic. Everything is subjugated to this market mechanisms that we are all partaking in. We're all allowing to exist. And I think we have to start picking up the thread somewhere. And the first thread is the thread of responsibility, becoming more aware politically and environmentally and socially, and reconnecting with this, with food and its source and the politics that goes with it. Now, there was a mention by Gabe about the importance of having a ministry or a department or something. I mean, it is true, there should be a department or a ministry of food, not a ministry for food as master chef or entertainment, but something that really looks at everything, supply chains, our dependency on supply chains from overseas. At the moment, everything, every package you have when you go and buy something is made in China. Most of the herbicide and pesticides and so on, which arguably shouldn't be there, but they come from overseas or from Monsanto. We have delegated food to forces that are beyond our control at the moment. And I think there should be a strong alliance with the farming sector, with regional communities, and just try to regain some measure of control, or at least of understanding, and of this very complex picture. And in essence, the idea of having a ministry should actually make the state accountable. If we live in a democracy, the state is not there to serve various forms, various mechanisms of the market, be they supermarkets or farming, corporate farming interests, transport industry, whatever it may be. The state should be a democratic state that looks after its people. And in that sense, a ministry would at least be a point of contact where the public can have some sort of interaction which is exposed to the political process. So it'd be empowering for us, because at the moment you can scream right, left and center, but no one listens. There's no, I mean, even in the arts, there's no ministry for the arts anymore. There's nothing left. Just think about that and draw a parallel with food and agriculture. Well, they are Department of Agriculture, but the departments in various states, they deal with technical matters. They don't deal with the fundamentals as we are discussing them tonight. Who is accountable? And to me, the state ought to be much more accountable than it is at the moment. It's absent. It has delegated, not hasn't even, it's had abdicated responsibility completely. And that is my provocation to you, is to think of whether or not the state as an institution, or states, because we got many in this country, whether they should be held accountable for what happens in our food industry, and that includes emissions, waterways, health of rivers, and so on and so on and so forth, because it's all interconnected. Big ramble, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Steph, and thank you to everyone. My goodness, that's a big lot of issues for us to wade through and shake down and draw out in various ways. I think I was thinking of two things while I was listening to all of you. The first one is really, it's not just a question for you, Gabby, it's really a question for everyone. But one of the things that's very striking about your book is that it's a book that tracks a very particular recent historical period. It's a book that tells the story of the neoliberalisation of the growing of food in Australia, and a story that tells us what happens when Canberra, our politicians put all of their eggs, if you like, in the globalisation basket. I'm struck that none of you have actually used the word globalisation, I don't think, tonight. But I'm very struck in hearing all of you talk that it's the elephant in the room, perhaps, or the question of the sort of the corporate drive to turn farming into something that is going to result in ever more growth. Scott Morrison's determined pitch to farmers that we love what you do, you're fabulous, but we will have $100 billion out of you by 2030. But for what? You know, this is a discussion that we've all been having, but it's not a discussion that tends to get up certainly in the national media very much. So I think that's one kind of, it's a given, yeah. Yeah. Well, that in conjunction, I think COVID and I think the closing of borders has got us all thinking perhaps in slightly fresh terms about the limits and possibilities of globalization. And so I'd love to hear a little bit of reflection on that. But in concert with that, each of you has very strikingly called into the discussion the question of tradition, the question of different kinds of traditions that perhaps could be drawn upon if we are seriously going to reimagine what we do with food in this country. And I know I could poke Stefano to have quite a lot to say about this. Gabby's book is wonderful for its literature reviews. And one of the books that Gabby reads, I was trying to find the title on my phone and couldn't, but it's Michael Simon's book, Gabby. Is it the gastronomical, sorry? One continuous
picnic, yeah.
Which is a wonderful and provocative book that makes the claim that Australia does not have a history of peasant farming, of peasant relatedness to food. He sort of charts this terrifying picture of what has happened from the moment since whitefellas arrived and started having an extractivist relationship to land, and it's a relationship that shoots in a straight line right to the present. But all of you speak very, very passionately in different ways about the variety of traditions that might be brought together if we're serious about thinking towards a new social contract in Australia. So perhaps just by way of kicking off our open discussion, I'll throw those two questions out there for anyone who might like to say anything, and then we'll go to some open discussion. Pete, over to you. Thank you.
I guess I'd like to throw a couple of things in there. I probably didn't go hard and condemn neoliberalism the way I probably would in another forum, but when I was talking about farmers doing things because of the way that they do them and why they do what they do based on market and policy structures, that's very much in line with the comment that Australia is completely out of step with most other developed countries in the world in regards how it talks about and deals with agriculture. We operate in arguably one of the most volatile weather environments in the world, and we operate in the most volatile market conditions because, in part, we have next to the lowest levels of government support to agriculture in this country in the OECD. So, you know, there's a really big issue in the conversation and how people talk about farming and talk about what they expect from farmers. Because if you have a right to have that conversation, if you you know, some of the comments around people's rights and expectations, you have a responsibility also. And so at the end of the day, someone's got to pay. It's the great challenge that we have is that there's this expectation that you can keep taking something out of the landscape, and what the landscape is a finite resource, and we can't keep mining it, which is the current production model, and that productivity growth model is all about mining. It's not about sustainability. It's not about leaving the landscape better than it was. It's not about stewardship. It's about mining. And that's the great dissonance that exists, because if you talk to farmers, the middle farmers that Gabby talked to, we're hollowing out and getting rid of, they're the ones who want to leave it, you know, a legacy, if you like, for the next generation. And they're the ones who aren't able to sustain their businesses. They're the ones who are disappearing. And that's a real problem for where we're heading as a nation into the future. I think that fundamentally comes to one of the things that nearly every conversation have about contentious issues. You hear people talking about their rights. And my quid pro quo is, okay, well, what's your responsibility? And there are agricultural ministries all over the country, but they are perpetuating that neoliberal approach to agriculture, and the NFF is promoting it as well. In the face of an industry that is facing declining terms of trade, so our costs are rising, our revenues aren't rising in line with those costs, productivity is plateauing and starting to decline in some instances. The issues around climate change is a permanent disruptor. We can adapt, but we have already developed farming systems that are arguably the best in the world at managing weather volatility. But climate change presents a new level of volatility that we just can't manage. We can't mitigate that within our farming system. So there's some pretty dark days ahead for agriculture if we don't change the frame and what we think we need to do for agriculture, whether it's food or it's fibre or whatever it happens to be. But I believe that agriculture is much more about stewardship. And if you want agriculture to survive somewhere, somehow, we need to start paying for practice change. It's practices you got to pay for, not commodities. If you keep relying on the commodity as the income source for agriculture, you'll keep getting what you're getting from agriculture. And agriculture will eventually fail. And I mean, Gabby talked about the importance of agriculture from a strategic perspective. Food security is key to geopolitical stability in the region. We need to be doing it as well as it can be done, in the interests of the stability and security of a whole bunch of people, not just Australians. And Australia needs to step up with that as an affluent first world country. We have a responsibility to lead in this space. And if we don't, who will? Anyway, I'll be quiet again and see where the conversation goes.
Thanks very much, Pete. Steph's here now.
Quick question for Gabe. With farmers at an average of what, 58 years now? Can you hear me? How do you how do you see the next 10, 15 years unfolding, given that the middle is hollowing out and the age is increasing very, very rapidly? Do you see an expansion of corporate farming or what? What's your feeling?
I think that I see an expansion of a very large model, and that can be corporate farming or it can be corporatized families. And that is because that's where scale pushes the business. I mean, the things that Pete talked about just then are very real. You can see them in the newspapers every day. You can see a massive price rise in land prices. Rural land prices have increased. You would know this around Mildura, and it's happening just about everywhere. More than the Sydney, Melbourne property price balloon that we hear about almost daily in the papers. You can see in the rural papers, those land prices are increasing massively. And now to the point where Rural Bank says there's this divergence, a split between what a farm returns and the capital gain that it returns. So we're now in this stage where farms are like the block. You renovate them, you fix them up and you sell them, and the capital gain gets you pretty much more than the return that you would make by growing food. Now that's a problem. Same with water prices. The price of inputs, Pete would be much better on top of the prices, for fertilizer. But I think last time I checked, $1,400, $1,500 a tonne. So farmers who have lost, for example, this crop to a very wet spring and summer or to flooding are facing input costs that will be massive when they come to put their next crop in, having lost or severely downgraded the last crop. So these aren't esoteric academic issues that we're discussing here. These are very real issues. So the practice change that's required, that Pete talked about, is really important. And yet we know the culture of farming is inherently conservative, because that's the way you survive, you know, in a farming business. Yes, there are risk takers that go out on a limb, but generally, you know, you stay within the mob because that's the safest place to be. So if you're asking people for practice change in a very conservative culture, you have to make it safe to fail. You have to allow the conditions where you can take a bit of a bet on a different practice that might not bring as high a return, but might give you a bit more long-term sustainability. But there has to be at least some return for that. And so all of those things, I think, is pushing farming to what I think will be a very different place in 10 years' time, which is why I wanted to write the book now, because, you know, I wanted to say to readers, if you turn around in 10 years' time and the landscape is completely different, you can't say that you didn't know, you know. And the other thing I'll just say about corporate farming is, you know, there's all these models now out there that are basically investment vehicles to get a measure of, you know, a bit of your investment into farming, because it's seen, you know, in terms of global demand for food and in terms of population projections of 10 billion by 2050, it's seen as a sure thing, right? People need to eat. Australia has massive scale in a way that other places don't. Other places have much smaller farms. So Australia is corporate ready, it's investment ready. And so that makes it a very attractive place to be. It's also, notwithstanding the high land prices, slightly undervalued in terms compared with farms in other places. And so that means we're a very attractive destination. But as we've seen, you know, the most recent example, you get all the greenwashing on the websites about, you know, long-term custodians. We're part of the community. We want to be, you know, part of the community, part of the environment. And then when, you know, the pension fund's up or whatever, they sell. You know, this just happened with Macquarie Bank, sold Lawson's grains. All that stuff was on their website about being in it for the long haul. But when the fund that underwrites it is now sold on, because that's, you know, that's the investment strategy. So, you know, these are very different priorities that people are taking into farming, and we have to acknowledge that, decide what we want, and then, you know, say, hey, well, maybe we need to support the people that we want. They don't put the guys in the suits on the tomato cans, right? They put the guys in the overalls on the tomato cans. There's a reason for that, because I think the public want to see that. Sorry for the rant.
Thanks, Gabby. And just I just wanted to build on that, and I guess perhaps offer a optimistic, positive aspect, which is just, I guess, the sense that we mustn't fall for these representations. You know, a lot of what we're talking about is the messages that are carefully constructed by government, by agencies, by a whole lot of different private actors as well, about this is the ideal and this is what we're doing. And I think actually the kind of some of the seeds of what we actually need are still there. It's about the way in which much farming today, you know, remains a natural experiment. It's always about experimentation. And so that idea of, what was the phrase, about being, you know, able to fail, that's kind of a daily reality in a sense of like, you're always doing that. You're always stumbling. It's going through that process of learning continuously. And if we look at the history of some of the origins of agricultural research, for example, there's great examples there of people, farmers coming together into cooperative groups. You've got a whole lot of great NGOs around, like Birchip Cropping Group, who I've been associated with in the past up in Steph's part of the world, who, you know, really have tried to do things differently, but in a really compromised way. And I think part of the issue here is just getting beyond the purity of these either or type categories and understanding when there's kind of political representations that we need to understand the reality behind that. And the last thing to say there is that one of the greatest exports Australian agriculture has had, and I say this as someone who's worked for the Australian Council for International Agricultural Research, is actually our land care groups, which are kind of, you don't hear much about in Australia these days. It's sort of considered like it was a thing in the 80s, 90s with the, yeah, and they sort of, many of them still sort of stumble along today, but that's actually now considered to be one of the greatest Australian agricultural inventions. And the point there is that there's a lot of stuff in Australian agriculture that's not the product, it's the way we do things, it's the way we think, it's some of the knowledge around that. And I think if we see that sort of, you know, dare I say it, value added approach to agriculture, then I think we could start to see some of the true value and the depths of that in history as well.
Thank you. I forgot to thank Gab for writing the book. Thanks. It's really important. It is really important. It sits up there on my shelf with Cry the Reed Warbler and Biggest Estate on Earth. Thank you very much for writing that. Farmers are people. Farmers are human. Farmers can be fragile. Farmers can be strong. Farmers go through different stages of life. Farmers are really, really important. It's important we understand that the ability to fail is allowed for that to happen in Australia, for farmers to have change happen on their farms, but in their brains. In their brains, it's so hard for some people to make change. David Fenton had a place in Western Victoria. He inherited 2,500 acres of land without a tree on it, one cypress tree, all being cleared, all that beautiful red gum country being cleared. He fell in love with a woman from a valley, from the Victoria Valley near the Grampians, and her father said to him, if you're going to marry my daughter, you better start planting trees. He did, and he didn't stop until the day he died. Every time I saw him, he always questioned if he'd done the right thing. It was financially almost disastrous to the Fenton family, but he changed the landscape, and in doing so, he maintained the production on the property. His dry sheep equivalent was the same, because the trees protected the grass. So it got windy, the grass kept on growing because they didn't close the stomata up. The water, carrying the water on the property increased, and so he didn't have to worry about dams, etc. But until the day he died, he still questioned himself. He made the change intellectually, but emotionally, he still struggled with that. And like, we're asking our farmers to change remarkably in the face of, I do not know what it looks like, but it's not looking good, and I don't know how to tell the kids about it. We're asking them to change in this environment. How do we support them? I don't know. Is it a governmental thing? It's us. We need to change it ourselves to support. It's not us and them, it's us. We have to change the way we're responsible to start off with. If you can make a change in the way you consume food to support, what did Pete say? You're not paying for the commodity, you're paying for the practices. So if you're willing to pay for the practices on his farm to give a better product, it's better nutrition that allows him to change, you're investing in the future. I wish everyone luck.
Okay, we might open up for some questions, either here in the room or on the computer. And we have our first hand up over here. Just so people can hear you on Zoom.
This is a question primarily for Pete, but I think everyone in the room could probably help me. Do you have any advice for, as you said, it's pretty grim at the moment, it's a pretty grim outlook for agriculture in a lot of ways, but do you have any advice for someone with no agricultural experience looking to get into that field?
Not really. I actually think the future of agriculture is quite bright. I think that the problems that we face are not insurmountable, but to get to a place where we can realise that potential, we actually need to change one of the hardest things to change, and that's the representation and the narrative, the national narrative around agriculture. So sorry, I'm not quite sure how to answer the question, but I mean, agriculture it's not the realm of farmers. I mean, growing vegetables in your back garden is as much about agriculture and food as anything I do. We have scale and it's a sophisticated business model. It's a very complex farming system we've developed over time, to try and make and balance all of the competing pressures. I think part of this is about, as I said, it's as simple as putting a seed in the ground and participating and taking notice of what's happening, because agriculturists aren't necessarily wandering around with big hats in the bush, driving around Land Cruisers. Those paradigms are just, they're a misrepresentation of what it should be about. That's my view. There are great opportunities in agriculture for people to come out and start participating. One of the biggest issues we face is a shortage of labour. Getting out into the bush and participating and being on a farm and working there, it's actually not, I find it to be really rewarding work, and notwithstanding a lot of the stuff in the media about exploitive agricultural employers and labour hire companies, there are wonderful opportunities for people to come out and be part of the business and part of the team and engage in that. And maybe that's a good way to start. Just get out and immerse yourself in it and find what you like. I think there are a lot of things about agriculture that are rewarding, and there are a lot of good people here who, once you break down the initial barriers and get to understand each other, the conversations are really informative and encouraging. So, I don't know that I've answered your question well, but my immediate response to your question was the best way to make a fortune in farming is to start with an even bigger fortune. But that's just a bit of a farmer joke, so I'll let it go at that.
Just kind of on the topic of how to attract young people into farming. Pete, you mentioned that, agriculture has so little support from government. And then Lauren, you also mentioned that agriculture still has there's this elitist view that it's not a worthy profession or career. I've been quite encouraged to see grassroots organizations like farmer incubators trying to encourage young people into the sector, but do we need more support from government? Like, what else can be done to encourage young people to get into agriculture?
Go, Pete.
I think the government's notion, I've got to be honest, I actually think it'd be better if the government got out of the way. They generally stuff it up, is my observation. Look, I'm unaware of the Farm Incubators program, but one of the problems people say they're elitist about, agriculture is what, the smell of manure. One of the problems in Australia is that in the beginning, the agriculturalists were the snobs. They were the elitist group. In the space of a couple of generations, we've gone from being in the highest socioeconomic demographics in the country to the lowest. The National Party went from representing the wealthiest proportion of the population to now generally representing the lowest socioeconomic demographics in the country. A lot of this history is just history, and we need to stop thinking about our future in terms of the past. Our future can't look like our past. It can't. We need to move on, and we need to get on with the job of rebuilding what we do. I really do believe most farmers, most family farmers in particular, are actually, that's the key. If we can try and help those people stay where they are and encourage people to engage with them. I mean, you raised the point earlier that the average age of farmers is now 58. They desperately need help. There is an opportunity in agriculture. you know, there are wonderful opportunities for people to come and work in that. The challenge is about how you provide a pathway for people to progress. One of the problems in agriculture now is that if you go out and start working on a farm, it's really hard to progress to being, you know, a landowner and doing it for yourself. That used to be quite simple in an economic context. There's a lot of corporate agricultural opportunities there as well. It's a little bit drier, but, you know, the relationships aren't quite the same. I don't operate in a corporate environment, but, you know, there are plenty of things that are going on. And I personally think that, you know, the farming communities are the best people to engage with on that front. I think a lot of people think that agriculture is just a really strange, it's like a foreign, you know, or an alien country that you go to and everyone's different and they're all strange and you won't have any relatability. It's just not my experience. I think we see a huge number of people come through in short-term employment and long-term employment over time. And it's, you know, there's an incredible diversity of people and experience and backgrounds and stories. And those opportunities still exist, you know, to come out and be part of that. I'm not sure I'm answering your question well, but I don't think we want to keep looking to the government to solve our problems. I think collectively we need to start solving our problems ourselves, because we're going to come up with the best solutions if we can just start talking, you know, and communicating and breaking those barriers down, you know, at an individual level. We've got a better chance, I think. Maybe I'm being naive, but I really don't think you want to keep asking the government to solve our problems. Just start telling the government what you want.
Yeah, I'll come to that in a sec. Just to quickly answer the question, I mean, I think Pete's covered off on some of them. Two of the, I guess, groups or developments that I think are most kind of promising. First of all, you've got amazing connections and groups around agriculture among young people in rural agriculture, and particularly there's some amazing young women really leading some really, really important conversations. At the same time, you've also got something that hasn't come up tonight, which is a lot of action and energy around aspects of urban agriculture, which tends to be a bit kind of like, oh yeah, like, hello. It doesn't have the scale. It doesn't necessarily always have the commercial focus. But if we are going to get beyond these, you know, cut and dried boundaries and categories, we'll start to see these things are completely connected. And wouldn't you love to see some of the like New South Wales young farmers or something connecting with urban agriculture or something? What kind of dynamism would that generate? So I think there are some groups there, just to indicate that. Just on the government thing, Pete, I know where you're coming from. What I would say is that government is highly, highly influential, whether we see them or not. So even that idea that we have a small government, or that we have governments out of the way, that is an active policy position. That is an active, usually pro-business policy position. And so it's really a question of what policies we have rather than the quantity of policies, I would suggest.
Oh, I don't know how to answer.
We've got
Marry into a farm, or you inherit. You either marry into a farming family, or you inherit land. Gabrielle just said how expensive the land has become. So if young people were to move into, had a desire to become farmers, well, I don't know who is going to facilitate that other than some policy that, you know, would provide some small grants to become small horticulturalists, begin small, specializing in something. So there is, again, in my opinion, a role for the state. I mean, the state provides funding for everything. At the moment, there is funding for all sorts of investments and ideas. Why not to facilitate the entry of farming, and perhaps at a small scale for young people? So I disagree with Peter that the government stays out. The government is in it, and how it's right in without being seen. You discover it at every turn. It's there behind the scenes doing its stuff.
Pete, just before we come to you, we have someone else with their hand up. We might ask for another question first. Viesters? I hope I've pronounced your name reasonably. Viesters on the iPad.
Unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, hi. Hi, Stefano. How are you? I've got a very simple word, and it's a Balinese word, which is subak. S-U-B-A-K. It's probably the most important word that I discovered after becoming a jackaroo. I decided that I didn't want to become a hectare hunter, so I became a gardener instead. And I went to Bali, and I was standing next to these two Australian women, and we just done a tour which told us about this amazing Indonesian cooperative of water sharing called Subak, which was invented in the 9th century, and it has provided water for every Balinese farmer for over 1,000 years. And this one woman turns to her mate and says, bloody hell, we should send all of the farmers, politicians up to Bali to work out how it can be done. So look up Subak and you'll be amazed at this amazing concept. Thanks. And a great dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Viestas. Pete, back to you again.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. I think the government as a role is certainly, you know, my expectations of public policy has to change, and it's pivotal to that. I think the challenge here is that people keep asking the government to fix it. Everyone says, well, someone should do something about that. And probably that's where I'm leaning in my inference there, that the government is not best equipped to come up with the solutions to the problems. We are. That's the fundamental problem that we've got, is that we've got politicians who aren't accountable, and we've got a bureaucracy that's even less accountable, making up the rules and setting the agenda. And that's the great challenge that we have. They are incredibly influential, and they're landing us in a pretty poor place. We've got to broaden the scope of the conversation. We need to engage, you know, a lot more people and a lot more diverse and progressive thinkers in this space to solve the problems that we've got. I keep coming back to this. I see a future for agriculture that's really bright. I just don't see it emerging under the current thinking and the current lens, you know, that's operating around us. So I just wanted to be clear. I'm not naive in my sense of thinking we don't want a government. I think the government's got an important role to play. We just need to inform it a different way. Thanks.
Thank you, Pete. I'm now going to go to all of our speakers to ask if they have a final comment they would like to make. Well, if people, oh, sorry, there is a question. What? I'm very sorry. I've been missing questions. We will take another couple of questions.
I guess there are several themes that I've kind of noticed coming through. One being this kind of commodification of food, which kind of leads on to this kind of disconnection between the consumer and agricultural industry and producers. And so I'm sort of wondering, and kind of what Lauren was saying as well, kind of reducing agriculture, taking away its cultural and kind of social aspects. How would, we're talking about the Ministry for Food, but how would kind of constructing food and the conversation around food in Australia as a social right? There are conversations about that happening in terms of kind of, you know, food security and focus on the consumer. But how might that change how agriculture is done in Australia? Would it decommodify food? We know we're talking about farmers having issues with trying to prioritize profit or to survive. So yeah, how might that shift the narrative or potentially provide an avenue to change things?
And before I hand to the panel, can I just ask anyone who does want to raise a question to move towards the microphone? Thanks.
Well, that's an excellent question and proposition, and I think it would change things. I think part of what we see now is this really dehumanized vision of agriculture, coming back to those representations, that $100 billion industry. Behind that is an expectation of a radical decline in the number of people involved in farming, directly involved in farming. And I've got to say, in the climate change adaptation circles that I'm part of, there's this kind of conversation around, well, you know, agriculture will do fine under climate change. It will adapt because we'll still have farming, like the farms aren't going anywhere, which is such a dehumanized vision of agriculture. And even if the yield was to stay the same, which it won't, you know, it's so unsatisfactory. So I think getting the people back into agriculture, that means including seeing the people that are already there that have been invisibilized and marginalized. And so that's, you know, other members of farm families, and there's a big gender aspect to that. It's about the broader communities and groups that are actually part of agricultural decision making, for better or worse, kind of getting all of that there, understanding that rural communities and small towns are core to enabling agriculture as much as the other way around. When I did a big study on the Millennium Drought, one of the key drivers of people deciding to leave was nothing to do with production, nothing to do with profit. It was everything to do with what the partner was expecting and coping with. And when they said, right, I've had enough, that's it, we're not doing it, we're going. Or I'm going and you can come with me, it's your choice. So I think that's really, really important. And then that would connect us right back to us here as well. So I won't go on, but excellent question. And I think that's definitely the way we need to go. Oh.
Just to follow up to that, how much do you think farmers are bearing the, well, and into the future, bearing the cost of Australia's pledge to environment COP and things? I've come back from stuck in New Zealand and from a rural background, and farmers feel very much that they're bearing the cost of the nation's promise to do better. So do you think that's the same in Australia, so that the tree planting and the greening and those things, let alone when we get down to food, is a direct online relationship from the environmental side of things?
Well, I don't want to hog the microphone, but just to say that there's a responsibility that comes with holding the land, and so there is a sense of which the bearing, I guess, from what you're saying, is that sense of being unfairly expected and not supported, and I would strongly agree with that. Yeah, I think one of the big questions in Australia is the extent to which the climate change conversation is taken up opportunistically, particularly the mitigations one, the carbon sequestration one, in order to distract from the bigger issue of fossil fuels. So we need to be extremely alert to that, which is a real pity because it perverts something that needs to be a really positive conversation. So, you know, as usual in Australia, we kind of make things complicated. But yeah, there's a sense of it, but it's all about the support rather than the need to do it. We can't question the need to do it.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for their inputs. Gabby, I've just finished your book and I really enjoyed it. So it's nice to be able to engage with you here also. My question is, no worries. My question is, in terms of the hollowing out of that middle sector of agriculture, and then at the same time, the feds are pushing a sort of ag tech agenda, which very much aligns with sort of the industrial scale of agriculture. And maybe Pete, you can talk to this as well. What does the future of agriculture look like under a more digital data-driven reality? And I guess then from a climate side, how can maybe tech align with whether it's alternative practices around regenerative, around more biodynamic, more holistic approaches? Is there a middle ground there? I don't know if that's a question or a query.
I would say there is a middle ground on that. I mean, I think in some ways ag tech is seen as a savior because we're always looking for saviors to fix the problem, and tech is one of those magic things that is assumed to be able to be deployed without humans. And so it's often talked about in terms of solving the labour problems, and solving all sorts of other problems. Like the people that I talked to in the ag tech sector said, as Lauren talked about, you know, that we often think about what we export in terms of produce, but we do export a lot of ideas, and the ag tech sector has a capacity to expand in Australia because, as Pete said, the conditions are so harsh here. It's kind of like the New York version of ag tech. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. So there is that. Like the other thing about ag tech is I don't think we should always think of it in terms of large scale. So a lot of the tech sector is looking at things that are actually smaller, where you have, you know, swarm robots, or you have platforms that do that take different programs, and you have a number of things rather than one big, you know, robotic thing that requires big resources. But it doesn't solve everything. And I think that what I'm seeing on the ground through our local land care is the testing of things like moisture probes, you know, water sensors. So that idea of a smart farm that tells you what's going on in the farm the way that we think of a smart house in an urban environment. So the water's doing this, or you've got this much of a soil moisture profile, or, you know, all of those sorts of things. The big conversation that I hear about, though, in terms of data is probably reflects other areas, and that is who owns the data, and does the farmer remain the owner of his or her data? How is that going to work? Because increasingly, you know, I don't know about Pete, but you know, we've got a platform that a smartphone app that manages, you know, livestock, and that's how we record everything. And so all of that data is going in there, and you want these things to do a job. And it's a very kind of deep thought that's required. Well, what happens to all this data? You know, tracking all those things down in a day where, you know, you've got 1,000 other things to do is a really hard ask. But there is a lot of angst over who is going to own that data. And in terms of the environmental services market, we're seeing now the development of these carbon aggregators who are going to do the carbon contracts for farmers. I hope you can't hear that plane too loudly. And we're seeing the rise of, you know, farmer mutuals again. So almost full circle back around to the idea of a mutual or a co-op as a way of kind of circumventing the big finance from, you know, making most of the profit from the farmer's labour or the landscape's labour. So there are a few thoughts on climate and ag tech.
We're talking about people. We're talking about rural communities. Without people on farms, without people working on farms, without people spending money in towns, we don't have rural communities. We don't have towns. We don't. It's not just the hollowing out of the farmers. It's the hollowing out of Australia. And what sort of Australia we want to live in? Everyone on the coast and great big John Deere tractors inland, or do we want to have a patchwork of different size and scale that can be from micro-urban farms to big scale vineyards, to great big mega farms? You're always complaining about them, Steph. That's what we're now in the situation where those our futures have been made at present.
Just quickly on the data question, I think there's definitely a middle ground, and being able to sense all sorts of different environmental parameters is a good thing to the extent that it brings these things into visibility in a way that hasn't. But in addition to the challenges that Gabrielle mentioned, I think one is the ways in which it more tightly couples agriculture into a whole range of other sectors and systems that are themselves struggling to adapt. I'm thinking here, you know, the kind of ICT worlds, but of course also just basic stuff like electricity. So in a world where you've got more volatile electricity supplies, etc., the fact that your farm will be more and more dependent on that's a really important one. The other more subtle challenge, I think, from an adaptation perspective, is that it can encourage a just-in-time kind of mentality where the goal is to basically respond as quickly as possible to those inputting data points. So you're constantly matching, it's like a dance. Now that has a certain beauty to it for sure, but it can distract you from bigger questions about the future and the needing to actually change the path. So yes, but is the short answer.
Anybody else still keen to speak? Amy, are you there? You have a question in a chat. Well, there's been quite a lot of action on the chat, which none of us in the room have seen, of course. Are you there, Amy?
Hi. Yeah, sorry. I assumed that you might have been checking that as well, but that's okay that you missed it. Yeah, so I kind of guessed earlier, I think it was Pete was talking a lot about government, and I wanted to kind of check if you're talking specifically about federal government. And my question was around the role that you see for local government. So I've been working on a research project that's looking at how local governments are involved in food systems. So if you were referring more to state or federal or both, yeah, if you see any, I guess, positive actions from local government, or if you see a role for local government in this space and the issues that you've been discussing tonight.
Sure. So I'll probably step back a bit for a second. I think we should get rid of state governments, and we should have better, more proactive local governments and a direct relationship between them and the federal government. That's just my view. I just don't see any practical reason to maintain another level of bureaucracy in the space today. And part of that is reflected in what I see as a vision for rural and regional Australia going forward. You know, climate change presents challenges, and some of the things we need to change around that present great opportunities for rural and regional Australia. And this dovetails into how do you diversify and reinvigorate regional economies, and those processes then underpin, you know, more resilient rural communities, more resilient agricultural operations, and probably more diverse and more reliable supply chains. So one of those is just around the diversification and decentralisation of the energy generation network in Australia. So we have a federal government that's given electricity generators a free kick in regards to emission reduction. Static electricity generation is the easiest low-hanging fruit in terms of reducing our fossil fuel load, you know, hands down. It's just a no-brainer to do that. The opportunity then is to develop, you know, renewable energy hubs right through rural and regional Australia. Any town that's got a transformer or a substation next to it should have a solar system attached to that as well. And if you've got increased capacity to generate electricity, you then have, and particularly if you're looking at renewables, the idea is to build enough redundancy in the system that you've got excess electricity. You can start then deploying that electricity into other ventures and other items. So Gabby mentioned before about fertiliser prices going up. Well, if you're producing hydrogen, you can start producing fertiliser. You can start doing a whole bunch of things and stimulating industry and opportunity for rural and regional Australia. And that reinforces a role for local government. Local governments really should be able to take the bit between their teeth and become masters of their own destiny a little bit in that space. And a little bit of if you build it, they will come. I don't think that anyone has envisaged yet what the potential upside for rural and regional communities is if you start decentralising the power grid and providing regional people with reliable, cheap energy. And it's an exportable commodity as well, of course. So, you know, you start to complement a whole bunch of things. So for me, I'm not really answering your question directly, but I see a problem because every aspect of the conversation about the future for rural and regional Australia and the future for agriculture and the future in the face of climate change is dogged by a whole bunch of historical paradigms about how this all looks. And as I said earlier, our future can't look like our past. We've got to change the way we think here. We've got to crack these paradigms down and start reimagining what our future can look like. And I think that there are opportunities for agriculture to flow out of the back of that as well. And certainly we can improve manufacturing opportunities. We can start doing more in terms of value adding. In regional Australia, we can start improving our relationship with our customers. We can do so much more than we currently do on a commodity-based agricultural system. And I think local government is constrained in how it goes about its planning for that as well in a lot of circumstances. And there are aspects of local government that I deal with in part of our renewable, solar business to the side of what I do with farming here that have been really frustrating in some local government areas. And then suddenly you go to another local government area and they knock the door down trying to help you to get the job done. So, I said it's a bit of a mixed bag, but didn't quite answer your question. But I think, it'd be great if we could just go back and wipe the board clean and say, now, what are we going to do here that's going to work and deliver the best outcome for all Australians? And that is, in fact, a vibrant and resilient rural and regional sector in this country. And, we generally find the best solutions for ourselves. We've been doing it for a long time. We just need a few changes and a few tweaks in the way we think about it as a nation, and we might get somewhere really fast. So I'll be quiet again.
Can I just add to that, Amy? Just to pick up on that last point, the last book that I did called Rusted Off, after watching politics for a long time, I think the best version of policy reform that I've seen, the only form of policy reform I've seen in the last decade or so, has been where people have framed a reform outside of Parliament and then mustered the numbers inwards. And so the best example of that was marriage equality. But there have been other examples where people on the outside have worked out, this is a problem we've got to solve. Government isn't solving it. Let's get together and solve it. And then you go into the Parliament, get the politicians in a verbal headlock and say, this is what we want. And you actually line up all your stakeholders. Anyone that might disagree with you, you got to talk to them first and move inside Parliament as a united front, right? And so the examples I've seen around at a local level are things like the bunch down at Corriung called Acres and Acres that came out of the bushfires, where a bunch of locals got together, wanted to, because they were burnt out, the town was burnt out, cut off from their food supplies, FPOS machines went down. They get donations of 1 acre plots of land from local farmers, get people together to grow local veggies. They're a very healthy concern now, and sell local vegetables into a local food supply chain, and they're getting much better, fresher food. They've got government grants, so it's not as if they've done it completely without government, but they wrote their own future and then went to government and said, we just need this last little bit, right? We've done all the work, we've designed it the way we want it, and it ticks all the boxes as far as community consultation, because normally governments will make up their mind on something and then come to the community and say, okay, let me consult with you, and then do what they want anyway, right? So there's that version. And then the other thing I would say is just thinking about another version of what could be done to some of those earlier questions about young people getting into farming is just mentorship schemes. Farmers are an aging demographic, even though some people argue with the way they collect those age numbers, because they tend to be business owners rather than, people who might be working in farming who are younger. But, mentorship schemes that allow people to come and learn from someone like Pete. Imagine how much you could learn from someone like Pete, and he gets a bit of help along the way, and some young person gets a really good head start in farming knowledge on the ground. If I was an industry advocate group, I would be getting those sorts of programs together and then going to government and saying, hey, I just need a little bit of funding or a little bit of, jiggling of regulations to work out how we can do this so that we're introducing fresh batches of interested young people into agriculture. So they're the two things I think that I would say to you about local examples.
You know you've got a conversation people care about when you're running half an hour overtime on a Monday night. And terrific, I think that we're coming to an end around these questions of the future and young people's investment. I know Richard wants to say something briefly. I might ask Lauren if she wants to say something briefly, and I'm going to put Councillor De Pierri on the spot just to land us on this question of why we want to be in the political domain while, contracting these sorts of issues. Richard.
This is answering Amy's question. Local government is essential to diversity of food. I'm an advocate for diversification in our meat production. Our abattoirs have been brought up by multinationals, JBS Swift, Tees, etc. Some concerns out of Asia as well. We are not in control of our meat supply. We're going to be seeing a lot more of our meat go overseas, and we lose that quality and the access to it. We need more local abattoirs, and that is a local government planning issue. I know of 2 abattoirs, small scale, employing a lot of people in a small town that have been halted because of imagined concerns, not real concerns, imagined concerns about what will happen around that space. So I know 2 examples, one of those happening in New South Wales, near Echuca, the other one happening in Gippsland as well. We need local council to have a food policy so we can feed local people. Local councils need to have a food policy in an urban and in a regional area.
Terrific, thank you. Well, my last reflection is simply just to draw our attention to the fact that we are here, and I think this hybrid environment actually really reinforces that this sort of gathering, this sort of discussion is exactly the sort of thing that's needed. And in particular, one where we hear, perhaps more from everybody here as well. And so, just to reinforce the importance of continuing this sort of conversation, this sort of reflection across distance from Gabby on the farm there, Pete on the farm, and I'm sure there's others on farms out there as well. And also, those who are growing things here in the city and understanding the connections between all of those things. So thanks to IPCS for hosting this.
I'll say that thank you again to Gabrielle, because without the 2 books, perhaps we might not have been here tonight discussing these matters. And those 2 books are exquisitely political. I want to reassert what I said, that the policies come from politics. And I don't know which comes first, but it seems obvious to me that without thorough engagement of people who at one end of the spectrum who are involved on the land and people at the other end of the spectrum who are consumers, they have to find political ways of cooperating. They have to find ways of neutralizing the worst aspects of the current political settings, i.e. the National Party, which in my opinion is having a very deleterious effect on country life overall.
Not a fan?
No, not at all. And a lot more discussions, because what we did tonight was just scratching the surface, trying to find more threads and trying to find practical ideas that would accompany the political action. I think the two go together. But I've been here in this country for 47 years, and I've never partaken in a discussion like this about farming, politics, regional life, where to, what, when, how, by whom. I think this is really, really healthy. And with this project run by this organization on the future of food, I hope there'll be many, many, many more conversations, more articles, more research, more papers more conversations and more activism. And thank you again.
Thanks, Steph. So thanks very much to all of our speakers. Thanks, Gabby and Pete, up on your respective farms. Thanks, Lauren, Richard and Steph for being here. Thanks to everyone who's joined us. This is the third in a series of 3 discussion panels. The first one was held in March 2020, just before we got closed down. The second one was held just a month ago, and the third one is tonight. We look forward next year to, we already have 3 mapped out, and this is very much an ongoing set of discussions. It feels like an unwieldy jigsaw puzzle. It's really, really stretches your mind when you try and think about how you put a panel together to kind of tackle the variety of different things that we want to tackle. So please bear with us. Please come back. We'd love to see you all here again. Sending a big hug up to Mildura, to our friends in Mildura, Donata and Pat in particular. And thanks to everybody else who's joined us. And thanks as always to Carlos, the maestro, who's done a remarkable job here tonight. Those of you who are still here, please stay on and have a glass of wine with us if you'd like to. And all the best, everybody. Hope to see you in person sometime soon.